Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Sam Piha for inviting me and thank Temescal and Associates for organizing the conference. Thank all of you for being here and apologize ahead of time because I won't be participating in the group discussions later. So you will be having some contact with other really good speakers. So I know you'll be in good hands. But I want to use the time today to actually build on some of Sir Ken Robinson's message. I'm a big fan, and I actually show that little video you saw in all my classes and sometimes at conferences. But I know when it's shown that a lot of people, while they're entertained by it, don't fully get it. And that's because changing a paradigm is not simply about changing direction. It's about completely changing the way you understand what it is you're doing. And I would say, in many ways, the most important people to watch this video and then study it should be our policymakers. Because they're the ones in control of the paradigm who've been driving this train. And unfortunately, they don't fully get it. And so what I want to challenge all of you today is to recognize that as important it is to do good work, that expands horizons for children, that gets them excited about learning, it is equally important to challenge the paradigm, to challenge the politics that have taken us where we are now and created the kind of schools we have, schools that not only bore kids, but schools that are premised on the notion that some kids can achieve and some kids can't, that achievement is measured by how well they do on a test, and that all that counts is that performance. If we can't challenge that, then a lot of what we're trying to do is not going to work, because here's the other thing. As important as after-school space is, it can't make a difference unless it can also infiltrate what's happening during the school day. Everything that you heard about already, about the learning that's going on, learning that's active, learning that's meaningful, should be happening during the school day. We can't compensate for the miseducation during the school day through an after-school program. And so my challenge to you is to begin to challenge the conversation. So let me just briefly, in the time I have, say what do we have to challenge? Well, we have to, first of all, recognize that a lot of what's wrong with what we're doing is we're focusing on symptoms of problems rather than causes. And as anybody knows anything about health, for example, if you don't understand the cause of a condition, but you only treat the symptoms, it usually gets worse. So dropout, just to give you one example, we've been saying we want to do something about the dropout rate. And Arnie Duncan has said he wants to shut down the dropout factories. 5,000 high schools across the country that are producing dropouts. And I told Arnie, I said, you know what, it's worse than that. Because they're coming from middle schools that are also failing. And then there are elementary schools right behind them. And you know what's wrong? You can't just shut these schools down. You actually have to figure out what's wrong with them in the first place. And if you believe that the reason why kids are dropping out is because they're bored and distracted or they're lazy, then chances are you will come up with more punitive approaches to try to fix it, as we've seen in some places where they've actually started to fine parents for not sending their children to schools, instead of looking at what we're actually doing in that time in school. Or the fact that some schools have figured out that one way to raise achievement is to push out kids who bring scores down. Right? So I just want to encourage you, because so much of what we're doing right now, we're going to see it in the craziest way right now because of the school shootings, where there are 17 states across the country that are now calling for arming teachers. As if arming ourselves is the way that we will assure our security. And again, I can't say, that's why we need a different paradigm, a different way of thinking about this, because the logic of what we're doing takes us in that direction. And that's why I'm going to really encourage you to say, we really need that kind of out-of-the-box thinking that Sir Ken Robinson, which is so clear when you see it with the cartoons, is what we need to push for. Malala, some of you know who Malala was, the young woman who got killed in Pakistan by the Taliban because she was organizing for the right of young women to learn, and that was seen as a threat, right, by the Taliban, so they tried to kill her. She just got released from the hospital. Why would she risk her life for education? I know a lot of kids in America who wouldn't risk their lives for the education they're getting right now. I would say that she understood something that our policymakers don't get. That the purpose of education is not simply to go to college, to get a job. It's got to be to create a more just, a more equitable, a better society. We empower our kids by appealing to those higher goals. So when we talk about an education that expands horizons and an education that's meaningful, we're talking about an education that matters. And I would say right now, we're not addressing that issue with our kids in schools. And that's why for a lot of them, even the kids who do well, it doesn't really matter. I teach those kids. I've taught them at NYU, I've taught them at Harvard, I've taught them at Berkeley, and over again, I'll tell you this. If I tell them there's a really good book you should read, but it's not going to be on the final, they laugh too. Why? Because they've been socialized to do only that which counts. Right? They've mastered the game of school. And as my colleague Laborie at Stanford says in his book, How to Succeed at School Without Really Learning, right? Mastering the game of school is about pleasing teachers. It's not about understanding the importance of knowledge and developing that love of knowledge and understanding that knowledge is power, which is really what we should be after. So I want to encourage you to keep thinking about how do we understand why what we're doing is so wrong, why it is that we've been reforming schools, and the schools are not getting better, particularly in the communities that need it most. Something is clearly wrong with what we're doing. And as Sir Ken Robinson said, just raising standards, the Common Core, wonderful thing. I'm not against it. But if we couldn't teach the standards, guess what? How do we teach the Common Core to English language learners? How do we teach it to special ed students, students with learning disabilities? Who's thinking about this stuff? Who's engaging our teachers? It takes more than just raising the standards to change the outcomes. So we need to really rethink a lot of what we're doing in the name of reform. I don't have time to go into all this, but I want to say that after school can play an important part in this, but it has to be part of a different vision. So I want to expand a little bit about some of what Sir Ken Robinson said. Teaching and learning has to be at the middle, and as does extended learning. But as we know, and as you'll hear throughout the day, it's not simply about more time. It's about changing the quality of the learning experience. I was talking to some folks from the State Department of Education. They were saying they're now trying to move away from focusing on compliance to quality. Right? More of a bad thing is never a good thing. Rahm Emanuel was pushing for extra minutes on the school day. I had no vision for what would happen in that school day in Chicago. Right? More of a bad thing is never a good thing. So we need to really focus on teaching and learning, but the question we should be asking is, how do we make the learning compelling? How do we get kids excited about learning, engaged? Those are the questions we should be asking. We need to focus on safety and make sure that kids have mentors, because we know that kids don't learn in an unsafe environment. And safety is not a byproduct of how many security guards you have or how many metal detectors. I go to prisons now, schools now, that are increasingly like the prisons I visit. And anybody who's been to a prison will know prisons are not safe places. So if we can't get safety in the ultimate controlled institutions, how are we going to use that model to create safe schools? Safety is a product of relationships, of knowing each other, of looking out for each other. Right? How do we create schools like that where children are known, where there's trust? So children will tell us if somebody has a weapon at school. How do we make sure that every child in the school has some adult who's looking out for them, some adult they'll check in with and talk to if they have a problem they can't handle? How do we make sure that schools have partners? Because schools can't do all this work on their own. Some of them need a health clinic. Some of them need a nonprofit, a church, a business, some other partner to provide resources that the school doesn't have. Hungry children don't do so well. 1/5 of the children in California right now come from families below the poverty level. We have hungry children go to school every day in California and across the country. Ignoring those basic needs impacts learning. We need to make sure we're engaging their families as partners, not as consumers. As partners who we respect, who we engage with the recognition that they actually do care about their children, even if they don't know how to help them in their education. And we need to make sure that we're thinking about health and nutrition, because you can't separate the intellectual development from the physical and the emotional and the psychological. It all occurs in the same person. And so I was so happy to hear today that in Encinitas they're trying to bring yoga into schools. And Lori Grossman will tell you about mindfulness in schools. And right here at Visitation Valley in San Francisco, they're doing meditation, and they're seeing fighting going down and achievement go up. Why? Because they recognize that stress impacts learning. And all that's about bringing a different vision, a more holistic vision of education into our schools. And so we have to see this work in extended learning as guerrilla work, guerrilla activity. That we're not simply trying to add on to what schools are doing, we're trying to infiltrate the whole system to change what the system is doing to children right now. Because too many of our schools are dysfunctional. The relations are strained. When you go to schools where you see lots of discipline problems, lots of defiance, lots of disengaged kids, you know something is completely wrong with what we're doing here. It should not be like that. And what's wrong is the mindset that we've instilled. We are trying to motivate people by fear, fear of failure. And guess what? There are a lot of kids who already know failure. And that's not motivating them. We need to motivate them by the prospect of what could happen if they were educated, how they could use that education to help themselves, to help their families, to help their communities. So I want to build on several of the themes of what this new vision has to look like. And a lot of these themes come from, I think they got it right? Temescal's got it right. I agree with all these principles. So what does it look like? Well, this is what it looks like when learning is active. Here's a classroom in Hollenbeck, at Hollenbeck Middle School in East LA. This is how good the teacher is. She can stop and talk to me because why? Because the kids are in control of learning. They're so engaged, they're not looking at the clock when the period's going to end. What does it take to create a classroom environment like that? It means the kids actually know how to work together. Because it's not one kid doing the work, the other kid's waiting to copy. Right? It means they actually have to problem solve together. They have to work across differences. We call that collaboration, and we know that if you don't learn how to do that as an adult, chances are you're not going to function very well. That's high-level teaching going on there. A lot of our teachers don't know how to do it. A lot of teachers look at that, they're terrified. Because what they fear is chaos. And so what they're focused on is control. How do I maintain control? Right? We want a school where kids are in control of learning, where they're so deeply engaged that disruption is not an issue because they're so focused on what they're doing, on the learning. They're not thinking about disrupting. They're not distracted. That should show up in lots of our programs and the work we're doing. It should be learning that's collaborative, and that was collaborative, but it also means that Yuri Treisman, math professor at University of Texas, Austin, found a while ago that it's when kids are working together and studying together that actually performance goes way up. Did some really important research at Berkeley on calculus. Found Asian American students were studying together, African American students studying alone. Huge impact on learning outcomes. Because not only are they working together and sharing together, but they're reinforcing with each other the importance of staying focused on the work. We're social beings. And it is when we create an ethos, a community that has shared goals, that are uplifting, that are focused on the betterment of the person, that people thrive. How do we create community in our schools? How do we create schools like the Bronx Academy of Language and Technology? Here's a school. All of these children in this picture are recent immigrants to the United States. They did not attend school in their native country. That meant they were illiterate in their native language, Spanish. If you know anything about the research, these children are more likely to drop out of school than any other group in the country because you use your native language to acquire the second language. So they speak Spanish, but they don't write it or read it. All of those kids are graduating having passed 6 regions, 6 of the state exams in English. Now, how do they do it? Well, it helps that every teacher in the school knows how to work with them so they haven't been marginalized into bilingual classes that don't teach them English or Spanish. So math teacher knows how to work with language, science teacher knows how to work with language. But over and over again, what I was hearing from the children when I said, okay, what makes this school work for you? They kept telling me, it feels like family. It feels like family. I'm safe here. My teachers care about me. That's what they attributed the success to. And many of them were kids who had come out of schools that didn't feel like family, schools where they felt threatened, schools where you have to be in a gang simply to survive each and every day. If you can create schools like this that succeed with this population in the South Bronx, you could do it in Oakland. There's no reason why you can't do it in LA or Fresno or Stockton even. Why not? Because guess what? Poverty is not a learning disability. Neither is not speaking English. If the school has the capacity and the vision of how to meet the needs. We need to create learning that's meaningful, that is relevant. Right? So important that kids want to share what they've learned in school with their friends, with their family, with their parents. Yeah, how often does that happen? We want to create schools that help them understand themselves and the world around them. Schools where kids, like the school I visited in Oakland, and I might have to end with this story. I'm working with a school in West Oakland that's under pressure from the district to raise scores. And the teachers say, our problem here is discipline. And until we can deal with the discipline, we can't raise the scores. So the superintendent says, Pedro, go help them, please. I said, well, I don't know if I can help them. He says, try. So I go to visit. And all they want to tell me about is how bad the kids are, all the terrible things they do. I said, okay, well, let me ask you this. Suppose you're going to teach in a foreign country. What would you want to know about that country before you taught there? And they said, well, you need to know about the economy. You need to know about politics. You need to know about culture, religion, history. I said, why? They said, because if you don't understand the context, you won't be able to know how to teach. I said, well, how many of you understand the history of this community where you are? How many of you can tell me about what people do for a living here, about whether or not there are parks and libraries, where do people buy food? And although some of them had taught for over 20 years at the school, basic information about the children were not known, or about that community. All they knew, or all they thought they knew, was that it was a bad place. The kind of place you get in your car at the end of the day and out of the school often before the kids have left. Right? So since I set them up, they said they need to know. They didn't know. I said, well, let's do a field trip. And we went about to West Oakland, and we went and visited the parks, the library, 7th Avenue, where there used to be jazz clubs. We even saw some children who waved at their teachers. Got back to the school, and almost every teacher told me the same thing. They said, we were uncomfortable. People were staring at us. You had no right to treat us that way. I wasn't what I was expecting. One teacher, a relatively new teacher, said, I saw something interesting. I said, what's that? She said, I saw homes with gardens in the backyard. I said, why does that matter? She said, well, they're probably eating food from those gardens. And if they are, they may not realize that the soil is toxic because of lead, because this area is surrounded by heavy industry. I said, well, that's interesting. I said, what are you going to do with that? She said, well, I teach environmental science. I'm going to design a whole unit around the effects of lead in the environment. So she starts to, and I watch her, and she shows kids how the lead goes from the atmosphere to the soil, what happens when you eat food from gardens laden with lead. Children are fully engaged. They then go out to test the soil to figure out where it's most toxic. They produce these reports using GPS, mapping their community, start to see certain patterns between where the gas stations and the foundries were and where the soil is most toxic. She's thrilled. They're all fully engaged. They produce this great report. And at the end, she says, okay, we're going to move on to the next unit. And one of our students says, we can't move on. She says, why not? He says, because we have to warn the people now. She says, warn the people? So she turns to Pedro. Pedro, how do I warn the people? I don't know how we warn the people. I said, but I know the health commissioner in Alameda County. I said, let's talk to him. We do. She presents the research. He's so surprised because the only thing he's ever heard about that school is how bad the kids are. So he said, I'd like to hear the kids. So it leads directly to the next point, which I'm already out of time, learning sports mastery, because now the kids have a chance to demonstrate what they've learned, to explain to the county commissioner, this is what we learned there. They're on task. He's impressed. He says, okay, I'm going to send a letter to every household in West Oakland warning them about the effects of lead in the soil, and we're going to offer any family who wants it free topsoil. What's the point about this? It is not only learning that supports mastery, it is learning that helps kids. It expands horizons because now some of those kids actually think they can be scientists, want to be scientists. Why? Because they understand it does matter. That's what this is about. Thank you.